told you about Julius Malema, the disciplinary hearing he's locked into at the moment. It's largely because of utterances made on South Africa's foreign policy stance on Libya, threats of potential coup d'etat in Botswana, issues of land appropriation in South Africa, nationalisation of mines. Controversial, Julius Malema, but very popular, and what we've seen is many people coming out in support of Julius Malema, clogging up the streets of Johannesburg in protest. Chris Hart is Chief Strategist at Investment Solutions, and he's here to talk to us about this particular hearing. Now, some people would be saying, why would a disciplinary hearing attract so much market attention? Why is this important for South Africa?
Well, I think it's a case of, what Julius Malema has actually come with in terms of policy. And when one looks at economic policy, one of the most important things when one looks at an economic regime, one has to look at property rights as an important foundation. And Julius Malema has actually specifically said he actually is in favour of actually just railroading over things like property rights, and that I think is why it's important. Is Julius Malema subdued by this, or is he enhanced by this? And we've got to actually see.
He's being charged with putting the party in disrepute, making pronouncements on foreign policy when the government has foreign policy stances, economic policy as well. Has he gone too far?
Well, I think basically one of the things that I would say is that something like nationalisation, he says, is in the Freedom Charter, and therefore should be ANC policy. But he has done it in a very confrontational way, which is again contradictory to the ANC's platform of engagement. And so in a sense he's said, and I think he's been particularly vicious to people who've actually disagreed with him. He's actually come head on and publicly attacked very senior ANC people, cabinet ministers, etc. And I have a funny feeling has actually created a groundswell of
all right,
annoyance.
we may not like Julius Malema's disposition,
yes,
and his attitude, but let's talk about what he's putting on the table by way of policy. Nationalisation, as you say, is embedded in the basic tenets of the Freedom Charter.
But
many
not really.
ANC leaders, including Nelson Mandela,
yes,
when he was a youth league leader, spoke about nationalisation.
Yes.
He would argue that nationalisation really defines the aspirations of a social democratic revolution.
Now the irony is, if you actually read it, not talk about it, but not actually look at the Freedom Charter, nationalisation is never mentioned in the Freedom Charter. Okay, if I read that section, I could quite make I think a stronger case that it's looking for equality of opportunity rather than necessarily just dispossessing people of assets. That's certainly what I would read in, and that's if you read it itself. So I'm not entirely sure that you can just say nationalisation is that finished, open and shut. So it is subject to interpretation, and one needs to engage with people, not just railroad over them. Right. And I think that's what's annoying.
Let's also talk about this idea of Julius Malema speaking in his personal capacity, speaking for the party, and therefore that being interpreted as speaking for the state. If we look at what's happened over the previous administration, when the government embarked on a willing seller, willing buyer process, yes, for land reform, it moved at less than snail's pace, and it started, yes, frustrating even former ministers like Togo Didiza, yes, who already started talking about the potential and the possibility to look into land expropriation, because if they're taking it to the open market, people are not willingly coming forward to offer the state land. So when he talks expropriation, the ANC has done this before.
This is where one actually needs to separate policy, the spin around policy, versus the actual mechanism of policy, because there's a lot of frustration about policy in terms of transformation, all sorts of things that say after 17 years things seem to not have improved. Now, is that because the policies have not been strong enough, or is it because of the mechanisms of the policy themselves that are creating some of these hassles? For instance, farms not being available. I can get you the Farmers Weekly, open it up, and you'll see lots of farms available for sale. The only trouble is that the state has been wanting to target farms that are not for sale and ignoring farms that are for sale, and all sorts of peculiarity. And then when they do buy a farm, there's this Byzantine red tape procedure that's not the farmer's fault or anything. It just keeps the whole process in limbo. And then of course, you get the frustration. It's not, and this is in terms of what one needs to say, is it the delivery that's the problem, or the policies that's the problem?
I think, Chris, what I'm trying to get at here is that we can attack Julius Malema for his idiosyncrasies. But is he speaking on personal conviction, or is he speaking on party conviction? And many people would say, when you look at the behavior of the ANC in government over the last 17 years, nuanced statements made on expropriation, nuanced statements made on empowerment in the mining sector. Parliament just this last week has spoken out about the fact that they want to see before the end of their term a 26% ownership as entrenched in the mining charter. So when we talk about transformation, black ownership, these are not Malema's views. These are entrenched within the aspirations of ANC.
I think this is what needs to be said, that there's certainly the aim of policy and the actual achievement of policy, in a sense. And I can identify with a lot of what Julius Malema has to say in terms of the frustration, in terms of achievement, in one sense. All right, but then how do you justify it? Nationalisation is a policy that is known to fail. Right. So when we say personal or policy, is he doing this out of ignorance or is he being cynical? You know, because
I'll tell you what I'm trying to get at, Chris. For any investor right now, they don't know Julius Malema, they might have read about him, certainly an international one. What they need to understand is what's going on here. Is the party having a moment of introspection? Does this youth league leader represent a real and powerful faction within the ruling party, where in a change of administration these elements of nationalisation would be policy? Is he just a maverick on his own? What is going on here?
No, I do believe that there's different moving parts, as you correctly identify. There's different moving parts, and it's almost the path that the ANC has taken, where at the beginning it's a broad church, want to get rid of apartheid, that's the main aim, etc. And you've got very disparate interests in the ANC. And now that the apartheid bogeyman is now 17 years behind us, in a sense, and there's still progress that one needs to make, but these different interest groups now are also, they haven't reconciled between each other, and they're probably, you've probably got several different parties in the same party, and that's, and you could see this under the Mbele leadership, the disquiet. He held a much stronger hand, but under the Zuma leadership, it's been a lot more open and fractious, as it were, and this is one of the factions that come out. Has this faction overreached itself, and you've got other factions now kicking back?
Let's move it along on the basis of that thesis, because many political experts would argue that what we're seeing with this disciplinary hearing ultimately is a show of strength. This disciplinary hearing is going to determine who the real power brokers of the ANC are, especially as the party prepares for an elective conference in 2012. Going into 2012, what will this disciplinary hearing determine for us who want to know who's really running the country?
Yeah, no, I think it's important, because as you can appreciate, is that the winners and losers will determine, for instance, whether, for instance, we get nationalisation as a policy or not. For instance, whether we start looking at expropriation of farms with or without adequate compensation. In other words, in a sense, are we going to see an ANC that wants to change the constitution effectively to achieve certain goals, etc. But from an investor point of view, it's also quite important. What kind of commitment do you make? I think already in agriculture and mining, it's in limbo, right? Any investment that's taking place, there's just maintenance. With those two sectors have been effectively in recession for 10 years, and that's because of policy uncertainty. And this is where we need to actually look at it and say, is the ANC truly a non-racial organisation, or are they going to define whites as the problem? and actually then go for them and now. And that's important because we need to understand that.
In terms of policy confusion, other things that have preceded this particular disciplinary hearing, for instance, is the finance minister making a statement that says we need more flexible labour laws, for instance, and then being wrapped over the knuckles by some of his colleagues within cabinet and the party, saying he shouldn't have spoken out on what many see as a very obvious problem in South Africa.
Exactly.
So again, when we start looking at who the real power brokers are within the party, what does that mean for economic policy? Because there are people within the party who believe in a kind of a liberal approach to economic management, and then you have others who are left of centre wanting conservative fiscal restraint, flexible labour policies, promoting investment, and others wanting to see more of the state involved in the economy.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's what I call is the take faction stronger than the make faction, and etc. Is policy going to revert to take, or is it going to revert to make? And already, as I said, in the ANC you've got these various disparate factions that are busy fighting, and that's encapsulated in what I can't even call it economic policies, but you've got effectively almost 4 centres of economic policy making, 4 or 5 centres within the cabinet itself, with 4 different ministries, and you've got other ministers, like for instance the Minister of Higher Education, for instance, who's less focused on higher education, but he's gunning for that economic policy. Being as chairman of the SACP, and so we don't have a coherent economic policy, and it actually shows in our economic performance.